Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Catherine. With that, I would now like to pass the floor over to Lori. Lori, you have the floor.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome everyone. Welcome to Using Pay Transparency to Increase Value, Culture, and Innovation. And this webinar is sponsored and presented by Procom today. So pay transparency. So this is something that has been on the radar for contingent workforce program leaders for years now. And now it's here. So pay transparency has arrived. And we've seen a really sharp climb in pay transparency over the past year. And this has been driven by new legislation, along with these changing employee expectations that we're seeing now. Our guests today, they are extremely passionate and knowledgeable about this topic. So they're going to be sharing some of their pay transparency expertise and their experiences with us. And our hope is that by the end of our time today, the goal is that you've gained the knowledge to approach pay transparency with confidence, and that you have some pay transparency best practices that you can take away and implement within your programs. So as Catherine said, so you're listening to this through your computer audio. If you have any issues, if you need to switch your audios, feel free to put a message in the chat if you need any assistance. We are here to help. And then questions. So we love questions. We want to hear from you. I highly encourage that you take advantage of this panel list of experts that we have on the line with us today. So please submit your questions. There's a QA window at the bottom. We're going to save time at the end to answer your questions. If for any reason there's a question that we don't get to, we'll make sure to take notes and we'll get an answer to you within a few business days. And then question I do get all the time is, will the slides be available? And yes, we usually try to send them out within 48 hours after the presentation. So as many of you are aware, so SIA, so we're a global research and advisory firm. We focus on staffing and workforce solutions. And we aim to inform, connect, and elevate the staffing and workforce solutions ecosystem. And this is through our editorial content, our proprietary research and data that we provide, our certification program, and then our conferences and events as well. And our membership consists of both suppliers and enterprise buyers, and we have a unique set of each of these products and services for each of those memberships. Okay, so my name is Lori Teleshak. I'm the Senior Manager here on the Contingent Workforce Strategies team for Learning and Development. I support our certification and training down here with our CCWP Program Management and SOW Management certifications. Quick reminder, if you are CCWP certified, you do get one CE credit for this webinar, so please don't forget to submit that in there. Here is a partial list of our CWS Council. Just want to make sure that we extend a really big thank you to all of our CWS Council members on the call or listening to the recording. You're a big part of our organization, and we do really appreciate you all. So without further ado, so today's speakers. So I'm going to have each speaker introduce themselves, say a few sentences, and Daniel, we'll kick this off with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lori. Hi all, Daniel Kelman, Senior Manager of Contract Labor and Vendor Management here at Neuroscale Services and Engineering.
Hi, this is Denise Liebetrau, and I'm the founder and CEO of a consulting firm that specializes in compensation consulting called Prosper Consulting. I'm passionate about making sure people get paid what they're worth.
And Angela, we got you on the line?
Sorry, typical, I was muted, so apologies. Angela Westhead, great with technology, and also a contingent workforce and BPO manager at Zendesk. I'm super passionate about the DEI element of pay transparency. As a working mom, this is something that's really close to my heart.
Hi, Lori. Christine Sawaka, Enterprise Account Executive with Procom. What does pay transparency mean to me? Well, first, it's the promotion of fairness and equity for sure. And, you know, we work with a lot of, obviously, contingent workforce programs, and it's showing them what the best practices are.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you all. So let's get into our agenda for today. So we're going to talk about what exactly does pay transparency mean. And why is the pay transparency, why is it important in today's landscape? And then what are some advantages that contingent workforce programs can gain from pay transparency? So for those who aren't familiar, so what is pay transparency? So pay transparency is a practice, and in many cases now the law, of making information about pay scales, job classifications, and other compensated related information available to employees. And there's a few different forms that this can come in. So it can be disclosure or publishing of wage information, and it can also be the reporting of pay data. And Christine, set the stage for us. What are some of the goals of pay transparency? What are we working for?
Some of the goals should be attracting talent with the right skill set in the right salary range. You know, all too often we see jobs posted with a salary range that is sometimes $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. There's something to be said for getting the right talent if you do post the right salary range. You know, it helps to foster trust and transparency both internally and externally for your organization. And I mean, really most important, it helps eliminate gender and race-based wage gaps. And again, like I said, it promotes fairness and equity.
Thanks, Christine. Yes, there's definitely a lot of very good goals. And I will say, with pay disclosure laws, we have only just begun the tip of the iceberg with pay transparency, and there has been a recent wave of pay transparency laws that have been sweeping the U.S., both at a state level and a local level. And organizations are being challenged. They're being challenged with staying atop of these growing and this evolving and changing list of pay transparency laws. And they're also having to figure out ways in how they can take the steps to comply with these laws. And it's a commitment. It's going to take a commitment from our organizations. And while it is a commitment and there is going to be a lot of work involved, there's a lot of benefits to the organizations that are not just complying with these trends, but they're also embracing these trends, and they are seeing the benefits from it. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this. So Denise, we're going to start with you. So how is this focus on pay transparency and equity, how is it changing the world of work, and how are organizations benefiting?
Employers are getting their house in order. Most employers didn't create their pay and compensation programs with a recognition that the external world was going to see a lot of it. They might see some aspects of it as they're recruiting folks, but I think we are seeing employers get a little bit simpler in how they deliver pay guidance to managers about making pay decisions. We're also seeing in my practice an emphasis on almost running marketing campaigns internally to ensure that their employees and external candidates have an understanding of what they're paying and why. It's also becoming the norm. If you don't post a pay range on job openings, you won't get people applying. I read a statistics recently that more than 50% of people would not apply for a job if it didn't have a range associated with it. It also is part of the DNA in companies that do this intentionally to be open about how they're paying. It also creates the need to be comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. So it's creating a lot of change these days.
Comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. That's a tough one. Something that we could all probably do a little better at. So often when we talk about or we hear about pay transparency, it's surrounding the internal workforce, so those internal employees and those FTE positions. Daniel and Angela, I want to get your thoughts on this. So any thoughts you can share on how pay transparency is affecting contingent workforce programs and what you are seeing happening in some of your programs?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. So I think one of the key things I've seen, and I think there was a study that came out recently that showed that 90% of contingent workers that were polled were looking for the way to increase their earning potential in jumping into a CW role. So we need to start off with that as our number one talent attractor. So just from the start, having that pay rate range, so we're not wasting anybody's time, right? They can see this is actually going to serve my goal of increasing my earning potential. And it also kind of makes us the talent destination of choice in that way. we are also starting off with fostering that very inclusive, transparent relationship from the beginning, which is always a great start to any relationship where someone's spending a lot of their time. We want to begin with a very open and honest first foot.
Yeah, Angela, well said. I'll piggyback that and add that, for us here at Veriscale, transparency has been effective to drive adherence to our pay rate bands and the target salary ranges that we have for our contingent workers. And that's right there, probably something that a lot of people are saying, well, gosh, you're not the employer. Why do you have such a vested interest in that? Because we hire a select few job titles in mass volumes to the hundreds. And being transparent up front really about pay rates has enabled us to ensure equity amongst our teams, parity with our FTEs where it's legislatively required across the globe. It's also set us up well for converting contingents to full-time employees. Without that transparency, we found that the equity and parity issues were mounting and becoming everyday conversations at the various sites where we have mass amounts of contingent workers. So,
yeah, I think during my time at Twitter, we had an extremely high conversion rate. I think at the peak, it was somewhere in the 70% range. So again, it comes back to level setting, right? What is the pay going to be when we get from this role to conversion? And that's truly their beginning of their journey at Twitter. So we want to have that sort of level set from the start, and then also have that very trusting, open relationship when they did become our employee.
Yeah, I think just to look at it from a pessimist, contrary viewpoint here, on the flip side, I would say that such structure could occasionally cause us to miss out on some solid talent, which might be slightly outside of those target ranges. Typically people that maybe are just not ready for that next level, that salary band that they would fit into would request. Typically individual contributors, maybe not on that management level. So that's a potential drawback. We haven't seen it come up a whole lot, but here and there, it's a potential possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So, Denise, how have the employers with large contingent workforces, how have they changed their approach to pay, given the recent focus on transparency and equity?
I've seen employers put more resources to this topic, right? They're doing cleanup, things like pay compression, and I'll define that for you. So in the last year plus, we had inflation here in the U.S. that was fairly high, and we've had the Great Resignation, and there was a tight labor market, and we saw a heavy emphasis last year on bringing people in and really paying whatever they needed to pay to get people in the door. But in many cases, that created inequities within their internal workforce, right? They brought in new people, maybe higher than current people who have similar skills, experience, education. And so now I'm starting to see cleanup, like how do we fix that? And so allocation of budget toward solving that. I think we are going to continue to see more of an emphasis on making smart decisions when you get somebody in the door, whether it's a full-time employee, a part-time employee, or a contingent worker, that there's going to be a big emphasis by employers on getting it right when they first step into the door. I also think gone are the days where we're going to be able, as employers, to ignore the topic. Here in the United States, we've got about 27% of the population in states or locales that have pay transparency laws. With the additional emphasis on this, we have another 16 states as well as Washington, D.C. considering pay transparency laws in the 2023 state legislative session. Hawaii just passed theirs. So we're going to have more than 50% of the U.S. population on this. And there's plenty of these laws outside of the U.S. as well. So you can't duck and run.
Can't duck and run. That is a good one.
I think the other sort of issue for me when I'm banking on the brand of my company is making sure that we're not in the headlines for massive penalties, right? So that's just, again, like creating that sort of environment of choice to be on assignment for contractors. I'm always very mindful of what our external reputation is as well. So anything that comes up in the news about and kind of fines our fees, not only is that bad for our bottom line as a company, but it also hurts the type and brand of talent that we're attracting.
Yeah,
reputational risk is a big deal in this space. If employers aren't getting ahead of it, they're going to be on the list where they aren't going to be able to attract and retain people.
Yeah, I'll say from an objective standpoint, I think folks need to rethink how they approach contingent workforce management and sort of clearing their minds of traditional notions, whether that's responding reactively to legislative or Denise and Angela, to your point, doing the right thing and just having a good brand out there. We got to think about it from a different lens. I always recommend to folks is to look at how the rate card's structured. And again, being very objective here, it's certainly beneficial to control costs. And obviously, money is important to large corporations. But at the same time, similar objectives can be achieved if you look at it from, again, different lens. Maybe we look at it from a bottom-up approach as to a bill rate down approach. We can control markups. There's a lot of things within our control that we can control the cost, but yet again, be in cooperation and doing the right thing with pay transparency. It's a big element of change really for our industry. So that's especially IT contract labor, where traditionally that bill rate not to exceed approach has been the way, and that creates this opportunity for our vendor partners to negotiate with their candidates, and that's a good thing if you want to look at margins. It could be a very hurtful thing if you look at pay transparency. So, again, just being really objective here from driving compliance and adherence here internally, we've aligned our VMS, our rate card, target pay rate ranges, and all of that, to essentially proactively address these things. And then we have an exception process for those one-off scenarios.
Thanks, Daniel. So I see a question in the chat here. I'm hoping maybe one of our panelists can answer. So as an internally operated contingent workforce program, most, if not all, recs will be driven by vendor partners. So in this case, who owns or drives the vendor partner pay transparency? The vendor usually has a set budget not to exceed. So who determines what the pay transparency range should be when a vendor posts it?
I can give you my perspective on this. So
yeah.
I think I'm developing a little bit of a reputation as someone who has kind of like a tight handle on my supplier optimization. So for me, this is very unpopular sometimes. Set markup is kind of table stakes for participation in my program. Because then it's just very clean for me, right? Especially coming from a program where we had very high conversion, I needed to make sure that I knew roughly what someone was taking home. And I do see like in the Q&A, well, okay, what about co-employment? Okay, yeah, I hear you. But co-employment to me is art, not a science, right? So there are certain things that just throw you all the way over into co-employment, like if I was paying you equity or if I was giving you a bonus. But here I think there's a case for sanity with regard to keeping us legally compliant and not having that throw us over into co-employment. Now, again, if you start stacking up a lot of those little things, sure, you're building a pretty strong case. But if you're being mindful about how you're working co-employment into this and protecting your company from a risk mitigation perspective of staying in line with statutory requirements, I think it's a smart risk to take.
Yeah, I'll piggyback that, Angela. Well said. I'll also say that we're doing ranges, so we're not getting involved in specific negotiations to the exact dollar amount. Now, similar to what you would see on a job posting on LinkedIn or anywhere else, now that's compliant with pay transparency, you're seeing a range out there, right? So we're not negotiating the salary. We're not involved in those employee-employer type discussions, but rather saying, hey, here's a range. We want you to be within it. Now, from a contract or MSA perspective, that's common practice. That's been around for 20 plus years that, we can put language in a contract that says we're asking for disclosure of the person's pay rate. And of course, antitrust laws handling of data need to be upheld.
I'll add something as well. I think that it's Angela and Daniel, mean, exactly what our thoughts are as an organization too. It's all based on the relationship and the partnership you have with your suppliers, right? So as a supplier, I'm always going to, when we submit a candidate to you, we're always telling you what that pay rate's going to be, what their pay is. And you've given me, in most cases, either a bill rate range or a markup that I have to adhere to. So it's very transparent on our end, and there's nothing to hide.
Yeah, I feel like, oh, sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, go for it, Angela.
For me, the genesis of all of this is the strength of your ecosystem, right? Like, I don't want to engage, I can't build a compliant, successful program without a trusting, transparent relationship with my supplier partners. So that's why I think a lot of them put up with some of my more stringent requests because they know I'll go to bat for them and that it's a symbiotic kind of thing.
Yeah, Eric, you had a follow-up question there to my response. So not to exceed rate carding, yes, within the sense of pay rates into the person's pocket. So not a rate card not to exceed, but a rate card in the pay rate sense. And then, just going back to this topic here about what can we leverage from pay transparency, for us, we're looking at pay transparency by utilizing the data, comparing market expectations to rec fulfillment. And that allows us to constantly stay in front of any potential challenges or potential need to review our rate cards and make adjustments from one year to the next. Inflation, right? That's a big driver there. People start asking for more. That's going to be directly correlated to our fulfillment success.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the interesting things is I moved away from a program that was much more domestically based into a more global program. Where I am now is having a hiring strategy, right? So that I can compare like with like, so that I can make sure that I'm up to date on, I'm hiring someone in New York or California. What are the laws that are applicable here? And then I also always come back to having really strong partners. At present, I'm a one-woman shop with a little bit of support internally and some really great peers, but I need my partners in my MSP and in my supplier pool to make sure that they're keeping me apprised of what's going on and just really locking hands to get it done together.
Thanks, Angela. So can pay transparency policies or practices be implemented to current workers and contingent workers?
Yeah.
And can a buyer request current salary of their contingent worker?
We did it. So I can say we successfully accomplished that, and it's for the benefit in all cases. So what we did is we started to better understand the worker pay rates, and then we knew where our pay rate targets were. In most cases, folks got brought up to a higher compensation rate so that they were in line with our target pay rates. There were a few scenarios where people were slightly higher compensated than our targets were, and so we're not impacting those. We're letting them naturally attrit.
Wow. Thanks, Daniel. We're going to move on to our next topic here. So best practices for implementing transparent compensation practices. So Denise, you partner with organizations, HR consulting, compensation consulting. So what are some best practices for organizations that are looking to implement transparent compensation practices?
Yeah, I loved hearing Danielle and Angela talk about how proactive they are and how they believe in partnership and trust with the suppliers. I think a lot of this is around trust. So to build trust, you have to be consistent, right? And you have to make sure that you're explaining things in a way that it causes the audience to understand what you're doing. So for instance, if I've got a pay range and it's really broad, that's not very understandable, right? Like we're seeing some pay ranges being posted that are incredibly broad. So cleaning up your house and getting things in order and being able to articulate what it is you're doing and why. So first thing I'm seeing is a lot of documentation, comp guidelines, almost like in a old-fashioned employer handbook, but a compensation handbook. So what are our policies? What are our processes? How are we going to go about delivering pay for what type of behavior and work outcomes? And then the other thing I'm seeing is a willingness to have the difficult conversations and a strong focus on creating manager capability. So creating opportunities for managers to practice in training sessions, having difficult conversations with employees or contingent workers about pay, and making sure that they are prepared to listen with empathy and compassion when maybe there's a disagreement, and being able to articulate why something is being done the way it is. It's in a world where more and more things are shared online, you can see a lot of the shift from perhaps the older baby boom generation where pay was kept confidential, you don't talk about it, to you can go to TikTok and see Salary Transparent Street, a creator who goes up to people with a microphone on the street and asks people what do they do for a living, how did they learn how to do that, and how much do they earn. So we're in this really big shift, and so I'm seeing a lot more HR functions embrace this as kind of a pillar to developing trust and developing the brand of themselves as an employer so that they can attract and retain people.
Thanks, Denise. So, Daniel, Angela, what are some best practices to follow surrounding the contingent worker and workforce rates?
Yeah, I think for us, and this can maybe be applied to most project plans or rollouts, implementations, but a solid alignment with our executive leadership team so that they understand why we're doing this, why it's important, and how it benefits us. And then once that understanding is there, continuing to cascade to the different levels of management. Of course, our key stakeholders, whether that's HR, talent acquisition, procurement, are always vital partners in I guess just being there as a line of defense for questions or any sort of resistance that could arise from that. But I think clear communication internally and externally, of course, with our vendor partners creates an environment where our contingent workforce pay range is well aligned, understood, and also where parity is legislative required, it's in line with our FTEs as well. So, for us, we didn't just focus on markets where parity was legislatively required. We made this our standard globally as an organization.
Thanks, Daniel. Angela, anything that you've seen regarding best practices?
Yeah, I'm preparing for a groan from the collective audience here when I say this because no one likes this. But the bottom line for me to start with all of this is make sure that you have a clean taxonomy. Make sure that you've got your rate cards in place. And I know this one is not popular because especially in the economic environment we're in, rate carding is probably going to be an administrative nightmare that you're going to have to do at least once a year. And by different geographies, it's going to be really painful. But once you get that work done to set that standard, you can update it. And then you have a really good starting point to have conversations with vendors or with your EOR provider about how much you can pay. And just working on having those really strong internal relationships with your TA team, if you don't sit in TA, or with your comp team, to understand what the pay rate looks like internally. I mean, I think we all kind of understand that there are some times where we pull the lever of pay with shorter term CW engagements, but having that relationship where you can go back and get a sanity check or work with them on your taxonomy and your rate cards is super key for me to set a firm foundation for this.
Angela, I actually love that response. I think the taxonomy is so important, and it can often be overlooked. Daniel, so within your organization, what was the driver for implementing pay transparency?
Yeah, so we got in it, of course, because of being the right thing to do, because of employer branding and the perception out there of our company. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also got into it because we were just hiring a heavy amount to the tune of the hundreds of the same type of roles. And we realized that we were very quickly going to have an equity issue. Actually, we did realize we had an equity issue because of the noise that we were hearing. And so rather than spending all that time on a day-to-day basis, we said, you know what, let's just address the root cause of the issue and have some transparency and set pay bands.
So have you seen, as a result, any of implementing these pay transparency measures, have you seen any positive and any negative impacts as a result?
Without a doubt, yeah. I mean, for us, reduced attrition is one thing that we've noticed. That continues to go down. People are feeling more fairly compensated and more willing to stay. People are feeling like they're treated similar to, you know, their full-time counterparts. They're more likely to stay. It enabled us some better career pathing as well for the contingent workforce, that is, and measuring candidate rate expectations to rec fulfillment. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. That's been how we've been able to leverage the data to ensure that rec fulfillment stays on track, and if we need to further develop our rate card or revise it. On the flip side, I would say I gave an example earlier about the rigid structure of having these pay bands potentially causing us to miss out on some talent that may not be at that next level yet. Yet they're good individual contributors, perhaps, for example, and they just don't fit in our rate card. So that doesn't, again, happen very often, but we have seen it come up once or twice.
Yeah, something, Lori, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one thing Daniel said, you know, from it creates the equity across internal team and contingent workforce to conversion. And I think if you as, you know, contingent workforce leaders have those conversations up front with your suppliers and your partners to say, hey, you know, this is what it's paying as a contingent role, but this is what it's going to pay if it's converted. Those are conversations as recruiters that we can have up front with the candidates so that when it gets to that stage of conversion, there's no confusion, there's no, hey, what happened? You know, they understand, and then when they get in the door, everybody's talking. We all know, right? Everybody's sharing what they're making, even though, you know, no matter what you say, everybody's talking. When they start to talk, it's not such a, well, why are you making that? I'm only making this conversation, right? So I think that, again, it goes to that relationship you have with your staffing partners.
Yeah. Thanks, Christine.
Hey, Lori, there was a question in the chat. Field a few of these.
Yeah, go for it, Daniel. Yep, that's what it's there for.
Jonathan, you asked about hiring managers wanting to be very involved in what contingent workers being paid. How do we avoid that? So kind of go back to alignment with leadership and then having your key stakeholders or lines of defense with HR, talent acquisition, or procurement, and making sure that the organization at large understands what we're here to do, what the objectives are, why this is valuable. From there, I would add there's probably a little bit of education that needs to happen with that particular manager about how we manage it, the fact that we have a language in the contract that enables us to govern it. For example, if it makes them feel comfortable, we could even put some audit language in there that says that we'll occasionally, from time to time, reach out to vendors and ask them, what are you paying your people? And so if we have that in there, it allows us to really manage those conversations with the managers. I hope that helps, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. It looks like we've got another one in here, which I think is a really interesting question. So how do you account for the difference in benefits? So the level of benefits through an employer of record is going to be different from that than internal employees. So how do you take into account that difference with pay bands?
Yeah, it's an awesome point. So for us, what we've done is taken a certain point in the full-time employee's salary band, and we've taken a particular percentile of that so as to offset some of those other perks that a full-time employee may get, which a contingent worker may not, whether that's 401k or bonus or this or that, even non-monetary things like stability. By us focusing on a different point of percentile within that salary band, we can sort of make it as close as we could possibly get.
Thanks, Daniel. So creating a transparent environment for candidates and employees. And Denise, I would love your input on this too. So how can we create a transparent environment for candidates and employees? How can we create this environment?
Yeah, so I think, again, it starts off with that first contact. So for me, the first contact we make with a candidate in their candidate journey with us is really what sets the tone for the rest of their experience as a contingent worker. So it goes back again to starting with the pay rate range and having it be correct, right? Not having it be $1 to $1 million. I mean, I know I was recently on the job market, and just anecdotal evidence, if it didn't have a pay rate range or it had a crazy one, no, I don't want to start that relationship that's so important and serious to me with that level of lack of almost taking my time seriously. So that's the starting point for me. And then being transparent when you actually get to the offer, talking about what makes up the offer, talking about what makes up the price. With regard to our friends on the vendor side, I also take the time to educate my hiring managers about what the markup actually pays for as well, so that they understand that the out-the-door cost of a contingent worker isn't just the pay rate and then a 45% markup that the vendor is just taking home, right? It does pay for other things that are a part of the candidate's experience and the contractor's time with you as well. So just continuing to have the transparent conversations about what the pay rate ranges are, what we're paying for, and how we're taking care of our contractors as humans is really key to setting that foundational relationship with all of the stakeholders at the table.
If there was an applause emoji that I could send across the chat, I would do it right now.
Thank you.
I would too. That's a brilliant answer. Just to piggyback on that, I think, it really is about experience, the experience of the employee, experience of a candidate, experience of a contingent worker in this dialogue. And it's dialogue. It's not a one and done conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. I also think, make it easy. Make it easier for managers and people who are having these conversations to have the conversation. Write talking points, write FAQs, document how you expect people to answer some of the difficult conversation questions. I love the question about the difference between contingent worker pay and, the fact that there's a difference between what full-time employees earn in terms of benefits and other things that contingent workers don't necessarily earn. I think education and teaching people those things that we just automatically know, we're in the trenches every day, teaching people about those differences, people will go, oh, I see. And then they'll get it, right? So, open the kimono, talk about it. Don't hide, document your answers to some of these difficult questions so you're very consistent in how you answer them. And always, always, always think about the experience that you're delivering.
And I think it's okay to ask questions of your vendor partners too. So for me, I'm very cognizant of what benefits my vendor partners do offer, right? So I can understand, number one, I can make sure that the contractors that we're bringing on assignment are being taken care of. I want to make sure that when you're working for us, that you're not thinking about how am I going to pay for this or how am I going to cover that? I mean, you're probably going to think about it anyway a little bit, right? But I want to make sure that there's coverage there. And then I also want to be able to be educational with my hiring managers and say, hey, this is what they're actually getting as a part of this. And don't worry, they're not going to be looking for something better during their assignment. And if you have a partner that doesn't want to tell you, fine, then they don't have to. But then it's also your prerogative as a program leader to not invite them to bid on your requisitions as well. So that's my program management style. As you guys can tell, I'm probably a little overly involved in some of these conversations. But your mileage may vary. That's just how I like to manage my program and how I like to make sure that our contractors are being well looked after.
Yeah, there's a follow-up. Eric, I see your follow-up questions there, and I think I'm picking up what you're laying down. So in the same regards that we have the ability to say, hey, here are our pay rate bands that we would like to ensure candidates stick within, you could take a similar approach. We did not, but you could take a similar approach with regards to 401k, PTO, benefits and things like that, and comparing that to full-time employees. Now, what we did was we just offset those numbers by offering a higher pay so that the compensation is still there, it's still happening. Another spin on that is, of course, to mandate, in the same way you mandate pay rates, mandate certain benefits.
That's an interesting approach. I like it.
I will say this. One of the things that I'm doing with one employer right now is we're doing an analysis on living wages. They're a global employer, and are they paying living wages in all the countries where they have employees in? They are starting to talk about, do we require our suppliers to pay living wages to contingent workers as part of the contract agreement? So, not only do we have to worry about pay transparency and pay equity, but living wage is a topic that I'm seeing more and more. I want to go back to one of the questions I see in the chat. Kevin asked, is there a legal compliance today for contingent worker pay transparency on every rec, even if posted by external vendor partner, or is this just best practice? FTE recs, depending on states, is mandated, but I have not heard this for contingent workers. You're right. It's not consistent for contingent workers, and it's not even consistent across states or local jurisdictions for a full-time employee. So there's very much inconsistency. I would hope, just for the sake of employers and people trying to manage all this stuff, that things become a little more consistent going forward, but we'll see.
We'll see. Thanks, Denise. I did see another great question, which I think that you might be able to help with. So, what does a typical validation process or review cycle look like to find these opportunities to better align pay when there is misalignment?
Are you speaking from an employee?
Yeah. When you're consulting with organizations, so what does that validation process look like, or in that review cycle look like to find opportunities to better align pay when there is misalignment?
Yeah, usually it's called a pay equity audit or a pay equity analysis, and there are a couple different ways to do it. If you've got a big enough pool of employees or people in your workforce, contingent workers, et cetera, where you want to do this, it's a statistical analysis. And there are firms, both law firms and other specialists, who have statisticians and people on staff who can help you. If you don't have a big enough sample size to run statistics to find out if you have disparities in pay that need to be solved, then you can run things based on median or average and things like that. So there are some standard approaches. If anybody needs a white paper on that, happy to share one with you if you reach out to me. I would also say the other thing that I'm seeing is having the investment in software. There's software that is available to employers to utilize to not only compare what is a competitive pay rate compared to your competitors for talent externally to your organization, but then what is your pay equity range in order to ensure that you're paying people who have similar experience, education, training, skills, performance, et cetera, in a comparable way. So there is software solutions for this stuff as well. So all to say, it's becoming more complicated, but there's supports out there that you can use to solve some of this.
And Denise, how often would you recommend that organizations do this type of review audit?
I would recommend you do a pay equity audit or a pay equity analysis at least once a year. To demonstrate that you have a consistent focus on this and that you're not letting it slide. Every time you have an employee or somebody come in and out of your workforce, you're changing pay equity standards within your workforce. So think about how many people you hire, how many people leave the organization, how many people get promoted, et cetera. So the pay equitable range versus the competitive range can shift day in and day out. So at least once a year, and then if you do end up in a sort of a lawsuit or some sort of regulatory complaint that you need to address, you can show a standard of care and concern as an employer that you've tried to stay on top of this and fix it if you found anything wrong.
That's great, Denise, and I think it goes back to that being proactive versus reactive that you talked about and really taking that proactive approach.
Exactly. I just saw somebody say they wanted that white paper. I'm going to put my email in the chat and the Q&A, and then if you guys shoot me an email, I'll send you the white paper.
Oh, that is much appreciated, Denise. Thank you. So Christine, take us home on pay transparency. So what are the most important takeaways that we've discussed today or from this session that our audience can really take home, take back to their programs to focus on?
So I just want to thank Angela, Daniel, and Denise. Great conversation. And some of the things that I picked up in the conversation were it really is all about the experience. It's about the candidate experience, the employee experience, and your contingent workforce experience. But it's also about the experience you have with your vendor partner too, right? So if they're not sharing and being transparent with you and sharing what's happening in the market, then I think it's time for just kind of a rethought on that as well. Making sure that you're making it easy for your hiring managers and your team overall. Ask those questions of your vendor partners. They should be sharing information with you. And what I've seen with some of our clients is large pay ranges that are advertised create skewed market rates, right? So you've got candidates out there thinking, well, I can make $100,000, but they're not at that skill set yet, right? So you're only hurting yourself and you're wasting time internally to screen those candidates only to find out that they're not in the right salary range for their skill set. And something else, that Angela said is you as an organization should be trying to be the talent destination of choice. I think that is so very important, and it helps us as recruiters to sell you. What are the compelling reasons to come work for you? This is one of them, that you are going to be transparent and open with what your pay ranges and your pay rates are. And then it really does create equity across your internal team and your contingent workforce team. So everybody's talking. Keep that in mind.
Yes. Everyone is talking. And that is true. And that's something to keep in mind when having these discussions. Christine, what are we going to provide our attendees today?
So for everybody who registered, Procom and Prosper Consulting, because Denise has been a wealth of information for all of us, are going to provide best practices and a readiness checklist after the fact. So that will be available in a couple of days. To everybody that registered.
Thank you. And then any other recommendations that anyone has to add that might be helpful for our attendees today? Recommendations, best practices, lessons learned even?
Don't be afraid to be the first at your organization. If it feels right, do it.
Start. Don't wait. Just start. Baby steps matter. Just start.
I think the be proactive, not reactive, I think has been like a big refrain for me in the last year or so. I think a lot of times in CW, we end up feeling a little bit like we're being order takers to the organization. And I think as the world of work changes, as the labor landscape changes, how people work changes, it's really incumbent upon us as program leaders to start being proactive and start like really operating like the subject matter experts that we are, and we can really advise our business as well. And I think taking the lead on this is just one way that we can really get internal reputations in our own businesses about being subject matter experts. So go for it. Take it on.
Yeah, thank you. So now I know we've been answering Q&A this entire time. Chat has been on fire. There has been so many good questions. There were a few more that came through that I'm hoping we'll have an opportunity to address. We have one. So do you find that pay transparency or find the transparency of the markup is more accepted in certain industries? There's a lot of reluctancy in the healthcare market to reveal markup and pay rates of contractor, or even to accept guidance on markup in the contract.
Yeah, without a doubt. Angela, I saw you smile. I'm sure you feel the same way here, but I'll go out on a limb here and just explain from my perspective how it's impacted or what I've come across. Yeah, without a doubt. Markup and transparency, both of those as isolated topics, certainly encounter varying degrees of resistance when you go from one industry or one skill set to another. But there was a time and a place where to ask for markups was crazy. People are, no, you can't know my markup. You can't know what I pay my person, right? But look where we are today, right? So again, it's all about understanding the value and the why behind it all, and utilizing that to be our driving force internally and externally. You're going to encounter labor categories or pockets where these conversations are certainly a bit harder. Not undoable, but harder.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, my experience in this industry has almost exclusively been in tech, right? So I think the cool thing about tech is that a lot of times we take the risks, right? We're the first to implement really good, well, maybe not the first, but one of the leaders in like implementing paid family leave, in implementing really great benefits for workers. So I think with regard to transparency, it's a little bit easier because it's become part of what people expect during the recruiting process even at the agency level. And again, not to be kind of hard, like I said, I'm really getting this reputation, but if you want a seat at my program's table, this is table stakes. So if you don't want to sign my contract, if you don't want to be part of the pool of vendors that I allow my MSP to release recs to, that's great. That's fine. We're not a match, right? So there's, just like there are hundreds of supplier partners, there are hundreds of clients too, right? So you can go find someone that will help you get to your goal. But if you want to be at my program and have a seat at my table, then those are, again, table stakes.
Very powerful, Angela.
Sounds like what you're saying there is that it's not you, it's me.
Listen, you break a few hearts in this industry sometimes. It's all good.
Yeah. I see another one in here, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but regarding how do you train or coach your hiring managers on having these conversations, or if a contingent worker brings it up? Any tips for that?
So the question, I think, is like how to have conversations with your contingent worker about pay rates. I always start with some pre-education that I never want my hiring manager to have a conversation with their contingent worker about pay rate range. I understand it happens, especially when it's a payroll worker that manager has sourced. Totally get it. Sometimes a little bit closer relationship, but starting off the hiring process for a CW by giving them a list of do's and don'ts for managing your contingent worker. And I know we started down the path of like, is this co-employment? That's one of those big ones that I don't really want to throw into the bucket of things that have happened that are co-employment. So having that visibility within the organization so they know where to come to direct the sort of employee relations type questions that might get kind of muddied, that's really important. And then having that base training of do's and don'ts so the manager is aware of the nuance of managing a contractor versus managing a full-time employee.
Advice. Thanks, Angela. So last question, and this is for all of you. So what predictions do you have for the future on this topic?
I'll start. I think this is the way of the world. This is the new world of work, right? You have to, the laws and legislation are coming. We're already seeing it. And I think that it's going to be an expectation for all workers, not just contingent.
Yeah, if you look at the trend line of states and countries outside of the U.S., for that matter, that have gone in this direction, it's only growing. Based on that trend line, I would expect that to continue to a point where, you had the very large majority of countries and companies on board.
Yeah, I just echo what everyone else has said. I think this is going to be just how work gets done going forward. And I think it's kind of an interesting, cool part of increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in how work gets done. Also, kind of like on the side note of this, I think as some of us ladies come up in the workforce, I think this is going to empower us to be better negotiators. I know, for example, I have a small child, and I even kind of take a transparency where appropriate with her about money and about salary and about career as well. So I think as people who may have been part of these communities that were more marginalized in the negotiation or pay rate range part of the world come up and become more empowered, it becomes more of a generational transfer of knowledge and ability to do well in the workforce. And then just in the Q&A, I saw a couple of people asking for some examples of do's and don'ts. If you'd like to add me on LinkedIn, I would be happy to just share with you some templates or some best practices.
Thank you.
And my prediction is that this dialogue will be either prompted by you as an employer with your vendor partners, or it will be prompted by contingent workers or employees. It's not something you can hide from. I know I presented myself earlier as a HR and compensation consulting founder, but I'm also a pay negotiation coach. So I work both sides of the fence, and I teach people how to ask for more money. And I had some of my employer clients who cringe when they see some of my social media posts because they're like, oh my God, I'm going to have a line out my door of employees or contingent workers asking for more money. But, I'm a firm believer in having the conversation. You may not always agree on the final outcome because there are things that you care about as an employee or contingent worker that your employer may not be as considerate of, but there are things that your employer thinks of that you don't think about. So I think there's education and should be, ideally we'll get to a place where we can have space with one another and listen fully and agree on why we landed where we landed. May not always agree with the outcome, but have the conversation.
Wow. Well, this was an extremely powerful and impactful conversation and dialogue. So thank you to all of our panelists for their contribution today. And I also want to extend a very large thank you to ProCom for putting together this panel of experts for us, for coordinating the questions on this. It has been so valuable, I know, to me and to hopefully most of our audience as well. So very big thank you to ProCom. If you want to dig a little deeper, these are some SIA member resources that we have on this topic. Encourage you to go check it out. There's a lot of resources, a lot of data on this topic that we have that you're able to reference. And I'd be remiss if I didn't plug some of our very exciting upcoming events here at SIA. So we have our CWS Summit North America coming up here in just a month in September. That's in Dallas on the 18th through 19th. Hoping that we see a lot of you there. And then directly following, we have collaboration in the gig economy. This is the 19th and 20th, directly following Summit. And I'm going to do a shameless plug. We have a CCWP class that week as well. So if you are not yet CCWP certified, come check us out. It's always a lot of fun too. And then lastly, just thank you guys again. This was an amazing conversation. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing the resources that we're going to send out afterwards. Any questions that we didn't get to, I'll make sure that we send our panelists and we'll get those addressed and we'll get answers over to you as shortly afterwards as we can. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your week and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.